In Victorian Britain, daily life was governed by an exhausting number of social rules, many of which existed less to make life pleasant and more to quietly judge everyone involved. If you enjoy sleepy history like this, do remember to gently press subscribe, preferably without drawing attention to yourself, which Victorians would have appreciated. Now, imagine waking up in the morning already worried, not about work, illness, or money, but about whether you might accidentally hold a teacup incorrectly and ruin your reputation forever. Victorian social rules were not written down in one neat handbook. They floated invisibly through drawing rooms, dining tables, and church aisles, waiting patiently for someone to make a mistake. The goal was not comfort or happiness. The goal was respectability, a vague and fragile state that could be lost through something as minor as speaking too loudly or expressing an opinion at the wrong moment. Silence, restraint, and mild facial expressions were considered virtues, while enthusiasm was treated as a warning sign. From the moment you stepped outside your home, your behavior was being measured. Walking too quickly suggested desperation. Walking too slowly suggested laziness. Making eye contact could be interpreted as confidence or arrogance, depending on who you were and who was watching. For women, the rules were even narrower. A lady was expected to be calm, modest, and almost decorative, existing in a permanent state of polite discomfort. Laughing too openly was frowned upon. Showing anger was unacceptable. Expressing desire was not discussed at all, unless it was to explain why it should be suppressed. Conversation followed its own complicated choreography. Certain topics were safe: weather, mild observations about society, and carefully filtered compliments. Other topics, such as money, bodily functions, or personal emotions, were strictly avoided. Asking direct questions was risky. Answering too honestly was worse. Everything was wrapped in layers of implication, allowing people to communicate without ever fully saying what they meant. This made conversations long, indirect, and deeply tiring. Clothing was another battlefield of social expectation. Dress signaled morality as much as wealth. Cleanliness, structure, and modesty were essential, even when they caused physical discomfort. Corsets restricted breathing. Heavy fabrics trapped heat. Tight collars made swallowing difficult. But enduring discomfort without complaint was part of being respectable. Suffering quietly was considered evidence of good character. Meals were formal events filled with unspoken rules. Knowing which utensil to use, when to speak, and how much to eat mattered greatly. Eating too quickly suggested poor upbringing. Eating too slowly drew attention. Finishing everything on your plate could appear greedy, while leaving too much behind suggested ingratitude. The safest approach was to eat carefully, moderately, and with minimal expression, preferably while worrying internally about whether you were doing it correctly. Social visits were equally stressful. Calling on someone required precise timing. Staying too long was rude. Leaving too early was also rude. Guests were expected to behave as though the visit was effortless, even though both sides were usually exhausted by the performance. Hosts pretended hospitality was natural. Guests pretended they were not inconveniencing anyone. Everyone pretended this arrangement was enjoyable. Children were not exempt from these expectations. They were trained early to sit still, speak politely, and suppress natural impulses. Curiosity was encouraged only when it did not challenge authority. Obedience was praised. Emotional expression was controlled. Childhood, ideally, was quiet and orderly, preparing young people for a lifetime of restrained adulthood. Even grief followed strict rules. Mourning clothing had to be worn for specific periods. Behavior during mourning was closely observed. Too much sadness was uncomfortable. Too little suggested moral failure. Grief became another social performance, carefully managed and publicly evaluated. Living under Victorian social rules meant constantly monitoring yourself. Every action carried potential consequences. The pressure was subtle but relentless, creating a society that valued appearance over ease and control over comfort. It was a world where the greatest fear was not disaster, but embarrassment. And so, as people moved through their carefully arranged lives, they learned to exist within narrow boundaries, hoping not to stand out, not to offend, and not to reveal too much of themselves. It was quiet, it was controlled, and for many, it was deeply exhausting. This constant vigilance did not end at the front door. Inside the home, the rules simply changed shape rather than disappearing. The Victorian household was meant to be a moral machine, quietly producing disciplined, respectable people. Furniture was arranged to suggest order. Decorations implied taste without excess. Even leisure was regulated. Reading was encouraged, but only the right kinds of books. Music was acceptable, provided it was practiced politely and performed without emotional excess. Idleness, unless disguised as refinement, was treated with suspicion. Servants lived under an even denser web of expectations. They were expected to be nearly invisible, present without being noticed, efficient without appearing ambitious. Speaking out of turn could cost a position. Showing personality was risky. Loyalty, obedience, and silence were valued far more than comfort or fairness. The household hierarchy was rigid, and everyone knew exactly where they stood, or at least where they were supposed to stand. Public spaces offered no relief. Streets, shops, and parks were stages where behavior was continuously observed. Even enjoying yourself required restraint. A walk in the park was acceptable, but lingering too long on a bench suggested impropriety. Physical closeness between unmarried people was heavily scrutinized. A glance held too long, a hand placed incorrectly, or a moment of unchaperoned privacy could damage reputations in ways that were difficult to repair. Courtship, in particular, was an exercise in patience and ambiguity. Romantic interest had to be expressed indirectly through carefully timed visits, letters that said very little, and conversations filled with polite emptiness. Passion existed, of course, but acknowledging it openly was dangerous. Love was meant to be controlled, managed, and eventually contained within marriage, where it would ideally become quieter and more respectable. Workplaces followed similar patterns. Professional behavior emphasized restraint and hierarchy. Showing too much ambition could appear vulgar. Questioning authority was discouraged. Advancement depended not only on competence, but on fitting comfortably into social expectations. Knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to present yourself mattered just as much as skill. Religion reinforced these norms. Church attendance was both a moral duty and a social performance. Being seen at the right services mattered. Proper posture, appropriate clothing, and restrained expressions of devotion were expected. Faith, like everything else, had to be displayed correctly. Excessive emotion, even in worship, risked appearing unstable or improper. Illness was also shaped by etiquette. Suffering was to be endured quietly. Complaining too much was impolite. Discussing symptoms openly was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Even medical care was filtered through social expectations, especially for women, whose bodies were treated as subjects too delicate to be discussed directly. Silence was often mistaken for dignity. As people aged, the rules did not relax. If anything, they became heavier. Older individuals were expected to embody respectability fully, having supposedly mastered self-control. Deviations were judged more harshly. There was little room for reinvention. One's role in society was meant to solidify, becoming fixed and predictable. All of this created a culture of constant self-editing. Thoughts were filtered before becoming words. Emotions were trimmed down to acceptable shapes. Personal desires were pushed aside in favor of social harmony, or at least the appearance of it. The result was a population highly skilled at restraint and deeply familiar with quiet discomfort. To live within Victorian social rules was to accept that ease was suspicious and spontaneity dangerous. Life was carefully managed, slowly navigated, and endlessly observed. For those who succeeded, respectability offered security. For everyone else, it offered a persistent sense of inadequacy. And so, day after day, people adjusted themselves to fit expectations that were never fully explained and rarely forgiving. They learned to move gently through their own lives, hoping to avoid attention, criticism, or scandal. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simply exhausting in a very polite way. This quiet exhaustion shaped how Victorians thought about themselves. Identity was less about who you felt you were, and more about how well you performed the role assigned to you. Class, gender, age, and occupation each came with an invisible script. Deviating from it required confidence, resources, or a willingness to be quietly excluded. Most people chose adaptation instead. It was safer to blend in than to risk becoming a subject of gossip, which functioned as the era's most effective form of social control. Gossip rarely appeared dramatic. It moved slowly, through drawing rooms and letter writing, carried by polite phrases and raised eyebrows. It did not need to be loud. A reputation could be damaged simply by being discussed too often. Once doubt entered, it lingered. Victorian society had a long memory for perceived impropriety and very little patience for explanation. Defending yourself openly often made things worse, suggesting guilt or emotional instability. Privacy, as a concept, was strangely limited. While personal feelings were expected to remain hidden, personal behavior was constantly scrutinized. Neighbors noticed routines. Extended families monitored choices. Employers evaluated morality alongside productivity. The line between public and private life was thin, especially for women, whose actions were often treated as reflections of family honor rather than individual preference. Marriage was presented as the solution to many social anxieties, but it came with its own restrictions. Once married, individuals were expected to settle into predictable roles. Emotional fulfillment was secondary to stability and appearance. Domestic harmony was idealized, even when it required silence about dissatisfaction. Conflict existed, but it was meant to be managed discreetly, preferably never acknowledged outside the home. Failure carried heavy consequences. Losing respectability could mean losing employment, social connections, or financial support. There were few safety nets for those who fell outside accepted norms. As a result, conformity was not just encouraged, it was necessary. People learned to anticipate judgment before it arrived, adjusting their behavior preemptively. Self-surveillance became a habit, practiced so thoroughly that it often felt natural. Even moments meant for relaxation were shaped by restraint. Vacations, when possible, were structured and purposeful. Leisure activities emphasized improvement rather than enjoyment. Games, walks, and gatherings were meant to cultivate character, not release tension. Fun was acceptable only when it appeared controlled and productive. The irony was that these rules were rarely questioned openly. They were treated as common sense, even when they caused discomfort or confusion. Many Victorians likely assumed that everyone else found these systems reasonable, or at least manageable. Admitting difficulty risked appearing weak or unrefined. Endurance became a quiet point of pride. Over time, these expectations shaped behavior deeply. People became skilled at reading subtle signals, interpreting tone, posture, and timing. Social intelligence was essential for survival. Mistakes were remembered. Success often went unnoticed, which was the point. The ideal Victorian moved through society without drawing attention, fulfilling obligations efficiently, and leaving no trace of inner conflict. From a distance, the era can appear orderly and elegant, but living within it required constant effort. The calm surface was maintained through careful suppression of spontaneity and emotion. What looked like stability was often sustained by anxiety and habit rather than genuine comfort. To live with Victorian social rules was to accept that life would be narrow, carefully managed, and quietly judged. There were rewards for those who fit neatly into expectations, but even they paid the price of constant self-restraint. It was a world built on appearances, held together by politeness, and powered by an unspoken agreement to never admit how tiring it all was. And so, as evenings ended and days repeated themselves, people prepared to do it all again. Another carefully chosen outfit, another measured conversation, another day spent navigating rules that promised respectability in exchange for personal ease. It was not dramatic. It was not openly cruel. It was simply and relentlessly exhausting. That exhaustion settled into daily rhythm. It became background noise, barely noticed because it never stopped. Victorian life rewarded those who could maintain this steady restraint without complaint, and quietly discouraged anyone who asked why things needed to be so difficult. Questions implied dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction implied weakness, and weakness, in a society obsessed with control, was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Even language itself was shaped by these rules. Directness was softened. Words were padded with politeness and distance. Saying exactly what you meant was considered blunt, sometimes rude, and often suspicious. Instead, meaning was hidden beneath layers of courtesy. Invitations were phrased vaguely enough to allow refusal without embarrassment. Insults were disguised as concern. Disapproval appeared as gentle advice. Communication became a slow, careful exercise in interpretation, where misunderstanding was common and clarification was risky. Letters, an essential part of Victorian life, followed the same pattern. Writing required restraint, structure, and emotional control. Too much warmth looked improper. Too little seemed cold. Every phrase was weighed. Every sentence carried potential consequences. A letter could strengthen relationships or quietly damage them, depending on tone, timing, and wording. Even handwriting was judged, with neatness suggesting discipline and character. Time itself felt regulated. Punctuality was a moral value. Arriving early could be inconvenient. Arriving late was disrespectful. Social schedules were rigid, yet filled with activities that often felt unnecessary. Dinners, teas, visits, and events occupied evenings and weekends, leaving little room for solitude. Being busy signaled importance and stability. Having too much free time suggested idleness, which was never admirable. Mental health, as we understand it now, had no clear place in Victorian society. Emotional distress was often framed as moral failure or physical weakness. Anxiety, sadness, or exhaustion were rarely discussed openly. Instead, they were absorbed into daily life, managed through routine and suppression. People carried their discomfort quietly, assuming it was normal or at least unavoidable. For those who did not fit comfortably within social expectations, life was especially difficult. Unmarried women, individuals with unconventional beliefs, or those who failed economically, faced subtle exclusion. They were not always openly rejected. Instead, invitations slowed, conversations shortened, opportunities quietly disappeared. The system was efficient, not because it was harsh, but because it was patient. And yet, within all this control, people still found ways to cope. Humor existed, often dry and understated. Small rebellions appeared in private habits, quiet friendships, or personal routines that bent rules without breaking them. These moments were rarely acknowledged publicly, but they mattered. They provided brief relief from constant performance, even if only behind closed doors. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the elegance of the era, the architecture, the fashion, the formal manners. But living within Victorian social rules meant trading ease for approval, comfort for respectability. The system functioned smoothly precisely because so many people participated willingly, believing that restraint was the price of belonging. In the end, Victorian life was less about strict enforcement and more about shared expectation. People learned the rules early, followed them carefully, and passed them on without much question. It was a society held together by habit, politeness, and the quiet fear of standing out. So, as night fell and homes grew quiet, many Victorians likely prepared themselves for another day of careful living. Another day of measured speech, controlled emotion, and polite endurance. The rules would still be there in the morning, unchanged and unchallenged, waiting patiently to be followed once again. It was not a life of constant drama or visible suffering. It was something quieter than that, a life shaped by restraint, maintained by observation, and lived with an impressive amount of self-control. And while it looked respectable from the outside, from the inside, it often felt like an endless performance that never quite allowed you to rest. By the time evening arrived, many Victorians were already tired in a way that sleep did not fully repair. Rest existed, but it was structured, purposeful, and monitored by expectation. Even bedtime followed rules. Proper hours were observed. Nighttime routines were meant to encourage discipline rather than comfort. Excessive indulgence, even in rest, hinted at moral softness. The body, like the mind, was expected to remain controlled at all times. Dreams of escape were rarely articulated. Wishing for a different life suggested dissatisfaction with one's station, which bordered on ingratitude. Ambition was acceptable only when it appeared modest and socially appropriate. Wanting too much or wanting differently was quietly discouraged. Contentment, or at least the appearance of it, was considered a social responsibility. This sense of obligation extended into friendships. Relationships were polite, stable, and carefully maintained. Emotional intensity was managed. Confiding too much could burden others. Confiding too little could seem distant. Balance was required, even in affection. Many friendships existed within narrow boundaries, comfortable precisely because they avoided deeper vulnerability. Support was offered through presence and routine rather than open emotional exchange. Public celebrations followed the same pattern. Holidays, ceremonies, and milestones were observed with restraint. Joy was expressed, but within limits. Excessive enthusiasm was suspicious. Too much laughter drew attention. Even happiness had to be respectable. The ideal emotional state was calm satisfaction, neither too high nor too low. Over years, this way of living shaped people's inner worlds. Feelings became muted, not because they disappeared, but because expressing them felt unsafe or unnecessary. Self-control became automatic. Many people likely stopped noticing how often they restrained themselves. The rules became internal, guiding behavior even when no one else was watching. From a modern perspective, it can be tempting to admire the order of Victorian society, the predictability, the structure, the emphasis on manners and propriety. But living within that system required constant adjustment. Every interaction demanded awareness. Every choice carried social weight. Mistakes were rarely forgiven quickly, and second chances were limited. For those who thrived, respectability offered protection. It provided access to stability, community, and opportunity. For others, it was a barrier, quietly reminding them that they did not quite belong. The system was not designed for flexibility. It valued consistency over individuality and endurance over ease. And yet, life went on. People married, worked, raised children, and aged within these constraints. They learned to navigate rules instinctively, passing them down through example rather than explanation. Each generation absorbed the expectations of the last, reinforcing a culture that valued quiet compliance. As the era slowly moved toward change, many of these rules began to soften. But during their height, Victorian social expectations shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. They influenced how people spoke, moved, dressed, and thought. They created a society that appeared calm and orderly, built on a foundation of constant self-regulation. To live with Victorian social rules was to live carefully, to speak gently, to feel privately, to endure politely. It was a life where the greatest success was going unnoticed, and the greatest failure was standing out. Comfort was secondary, expression was limited, and rest, even when it came, was never entirely free from expectation. So as days blended quietly into one another, many Victorians continued their routines without questioning them. Another measured conversation, another controlled gesture, another evening spent preparing for tomorrow's performance. The rules did not need to be enforced loudly. They were already there, woven into daily life, steady and persistent. It was a world that asked very little in terms of rebellion and a great deal in terms of restraint. And for those living within it, the true challenge was not surviving hardship, but enduring normal life without ever being allowed to relax into it completely. By this point, restraint was no longer something Victorians consciously practiced. It had become instinct. The rules lived inside people, guiding behavior automatically, like a second nervous system. Decisions were made before thought could intervene. How to sit, how to speak, how long to pause before responding. Life was navigated through habits so ingrained that breaking them felt physically uncomfortable, even when no one was watching. This internal discipline was often praised as moral strength. Self-control was treated as evidence of character, intelligence, and worth. Losing composure, even briefly, suggested weakness. Tears were embarrassing. Anger was improper. Desire was inconvenient. Emotions were not denied, exactly, but they were expected to remain neatly contained, acknowledged only when absolutely necessary, and never indulged publicly. Education reinforced this pattern. Children were trained to value obedience, patience, and order above curiosity or creativity. Learning emphasized memorization, discipline, and correct behavior. Asking too many questions risked being labeled difficult. Challenging authority was discouraged. The ideal student was attentive, quiet, and compliant, prepared not for exploration, but for fitting smoothly into existing social structures. This produced adults who were exceptionally good at following rules and deeply uncertain about life without them. Freedom, when encountered, could feel unsettling rather than liberating. Without clear expectations, people were left to rely on instincts they had never been encouraged to develop. Structure felt safe, ambiguity felt dangerous. Change, when it came, was often slow and resisted. New ideas threatened stability. Social reform challenged hierarchies that had long been treated as natural. While some welcomed progress, many viewed it with suspicion. The old rules, however exhausting, were familiar. They provided certainty in a world already filled with industrial growth, urban crowding, and economic uncertainty. Ironically, the very system that demanded restraint also produced anxiety. The fear of making mistakes never fully disappeared. No amount of respectability guaranteed safety. One misstep, one rumor, one poorly judged action could unravel years of careful behavior. Security was conditional, always dependent on continued performance. For those on the margins of society, the rules were even harsher. Poverty, illness, disability, or nonconformity were treated as moral failings rather than circumstances. Sympathy existed, but it was limited and carefully managed. Assistance was often accompanied by judgment. Charity required gratitude. Help came with expectations of reform and obedience. Despite this, people adapted. Humans are remarkably skilled at surviving systems that restrict them. Within Victorian society, individuals found meaning in routine, pride in endurance, and comfort in predictability. Life was difficult, but it was legible. You knew what was expected of you, even if meeting those expectations required constant effort. There is a certain quiet sadness in this. Many lives passed without dramatic tragedy or visible cruelty, yet also without much ease. Pleasure was rationed, expression was filtered, personal fulfillment was postponed or quietly abandoned. Happiness, when it occurred, was modest and carefully framed, so as not to disrupt social balance. From the outside, Victorian society often appears calm and composed. The manners, the order, the emphasis on propriety. But that calm was maintained through continuous self-regulation. It was not effortless. It was practiced, rehearsed, and sustained through mutual observation. Living with Victorian social rules meant learning to disappear into your role, to take up just enough space, to speak just enough, to want just enough. Anything more risked attention. Anything less risked judgment. Balance was everything, and balance was exhausting. And so life moved forward in small, measured steps. Days structured by expectation, relationships shaped by restraint, emotions managed quietly and privately. The rules did not shout, they whispered, constantly, reminding people how to behave, how to feel, and how much of themselves they were allowed to show. It was not a society built on cruelty or chaos. It was built on control, consistency, and the belief that order was more important than comfort. For those who lived within it, survival did not require heroism. It required patience, endurance, and the ability to remain composed while quietly carrying the weight of never quite being allowed to relax. And that, perhaps, was the most exhausting rule of all. By the late Victorian period, many people no longer remembered a time before these rules. They were inherited rather than chosen, absorbed through observation rather than instruction. You learned them by watching who was praised, who was avoided, and who quietly disappeared from social circles. The rules rarely needed explanation. Their consequences were enough. This created a peculiar emotional landscape. On the surface, life appeared calm and predictable. Underneath, there was a constant low-level tension, the kind that never peaks but never leaves. People were not encouraged to ask whether they were happy. Happiness was not a requirement. Respectability was. If the two overlapped, that was convenient, but not essential. Silence became a valuable skill. Knowing when not to speak often mattered more than knowing what to say. Pauses were intentional. Restraint was admired. Even disagreements were softened until they barely resembled conflict at all. Arguments, when they occurred, were indirect and exhausting, stretched over time through subtle gestures and polite distance rather than open confrontation. This careful living shaped relationships deeply. Many people knew each other for years without ever truly knowing one another. Personal histories were edited. Feelings were hinted at but rarely explored. Bonds formed through routine rather than vulnerability. It was possible to be surrounded by people and still feel strangely alone, connected more by shared rules than shared understanding. Moments of genuine emotion did exist, but they were often private and fleeting. A quiet walk, a personal habit, a trusted companion. These small spaces of relief mattered more because they were rare. They allowed people to briefly step outside performance and experience something closer to ease, even if only temporarily. The system endured because it was consistent. Everyone knew the expectations, even if they disagreed with them. Order was predictable. Deviance was noticeable. Stability came not from flexibility, but from repetition. The same behaviors, the same rituals, the same restrained interactions, repeated day after day, year after year. For many, this predictability was comforting. In a world changing rapidly through industrialization and urban growth, social rules provided a sense of control. They slowed life down. They made it legible. Even when they restricted comfort, they offered structure, and structure felt safer than uncertainty. But structure came at a cost. Creativity was narrowed. Emotional range was limited. Individual difference was tolerated only within strict boundaries. People learned to measure themselves constantly, comparing behavior against expectations rather than personal values. Self-assessment became externalized. You knew who you were by how others responded to you. As generations passed, the rules became tradition. They were defended not because they were pleasant, but because they were familiar. Change felt disruptive. Relaxation felt risky. Letting go of restraint raised uncomfortable questions about identity, morality, and social order. It was easier to maintain the system than to imagine life without it. Eventually, history would move on. Some rules would loosen, others would fade. New norms would replace old ones. But during their height, Victorian social rules shaped nearly every waking moment. They influenced posture, speech, ambition, and silence. They turned daily life into a continuous act of careful navigation. To live within that world required attention rather than strength, awareness rather than bravery. Survival depended less on dramatic decisions and more on thousands of small, correct choices made quietly and consistently. The reward was belonging. The penalty for failure was subtle exclusion. And so people continued. They woke up, dressed carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and moved gently through spaces shaped by expectation. They endured not because they loved the rules, but because the rules were simply how life worked. There was little drama in this endurance, no clear villain, no obvious rebellion, just a long, steady performance of respectability, repeated until it felt normal. And perhaps that is why it remains so fascinating to look back on, not because of grand events or shocking hardship, but because of how much effort was required to appear calm, how much energy went into seeming composed, how much of life was spent managing impressions rather than enjoying moments. Victorian social rules did not demand heroism, they demanded consistency. They asked people to be careful, quiet, and controlled day after day. And for those who lived under them, the challenge was not survival in the dramatic sense, but endurance in the ordinary one. A life made of small adjustments, soft voices, and carefully chosen silences. Not unbearable, just endlessly tiring. As the century drew on, many Victorians likely stopped thinking of their lives as constrained at all. Constraint had become the default setting. When everything is regulated, regulation feels natural. Freedom, by contrast, feels abstract and faintly irresponsible. The idea of behaving spontaneously, without considering how it might be received, would have seemed childish at best and dangerous at worst. This quiet discipline shaped how people related to time. Life moved according to schedules, routines, and expectations that rarely changed. Meals at set hours, visits planned carefully in advance, workdays marked by predictable rhythms. Even leisure followed patterns that repeated week after week. Variety was limited, not because people disliked it, but because deviation required explanation. Repetition required none. In this environment, boredom was not seen as a problem to solve. It was something to endure. Being bored quietly was preferable to being interesting loudly. Excitement suggested restlessness. Restlessness suggested dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction threatened the entire social structure. Calm, even if it concealed frustration, was always safer. Physical spaces reinforced this mindset. Homes were filled with objects meant to signal taste, stability, and propriety. Nothing too bold, nothing too personal. Rooms communicated restraint through symmetry and order. Public buildings emphasized seriousness and permanence. Architecture itself seemed to encourage people to behave carefully, to lower their voices, and to keep their emotions neatly contained. Social mobility existed, but it was cautious and slow. Rising too quickly drew suspicion. Falling was far more noticeable. People learned to move carefully within their class, adjusting behavior to match expectations. Pretending not to notice hierarchy was part of maintaining it. Everyone knew their place, even if no one spoke of it directly. One of the more subtle effects of this system was how it shaped self-worth. Approval came from meeting external standards rather than internal satisfaction. You knew you were doing well if you were not being talked about. Silence from others was often interpreted as success. Praise was restrained. Criticism, when it came, was indirect and devastating. This made life emotionally quiet, but not necessarily peaceful. Many people carried a constant sense of vigilance, monitoring themselves for mistakes that might never happen, but always felt possible. The fear was rarely dramatic. It was a background hum, present but manageable, so long as one remained careful. Humor survived in this world, but it adapted. It became dry, subtle, and often private. Jokes were understated, shared with trusted companions, and carefully framed to avoid offense. Laughter existed, but it was measured. Even amusement was expected to stay within acceptable limits. Moments of true rest were rare and often unnoticed. They appeared briefly, perhaps in solitude, in routine tasks, or in familiar company where performance could relax slightly. These moments mattered, even if they were small. They offered quiet relief, a pause from constant awareness. Looking back, it is tempting to judge Victorian social rules harshly. They limited expression, enforced conformity, and demanded constant self-control. But for those living within them, the rules also provided clarity. Expectations were known, boundaries were visible. Life, while tiring, was understandable. Uncertainty was minimized, ambiguity was reduced. You knew what was expected of you, even if meeting those expectations required effort. In a rapidly changing world, that predictability had value. It offered stability in the face of industrialization, urban crowding, and shifting economic realities. Still, the cost was personal ease. Comfort was often sacrificed to appearance. Expression was delayed or redirected. Many desires were quietly set aside in favor of fitting in. People learned to live smaller lives than they might have imagined, adjusting ambitions to what felt socially acceptable. As days passed and years accumulated, this way of living became normalized. Children grew into adults who replicated the same patterns. The rules persisted not through force, but through habit. They were maintained collectively, reinforced through everyday interactions that rewarded conformity and discouraged deviation. Eventually, history would loosen these constraints. New ideas about individuality, emotion, and freedom would emerge. But during the Victorian era, social rules shaped life in ways that were subtle yet relentless. They did not shout. They did not threaten openly. They simply waited, always present, guiding behavior gently but firmly. To live under Victorian social rules was to live attentively, to weigh each action, to measure each word, to accept that ease was not the goal, respectability was. It was a life that asked for patience rather than passion, endurance rather than excitement, and for many, that endurance became the defining feature of daily existence. Not dramatic, not tragic, just quietly demanding every single day, until the effort itself faded into the background and became what life felt like. And perhaps that is why it remains such a strangely familiar story, because even now, long after the rules have changed, the feeling of managing appearances, monitoring behavior, and performing respectability has not entirely disappeared. The Victorian era simply perfected it, wrapped it in politeness, and called it normal life. As those expectations became routine, many Victorians learned to measure success in very small, quiet ways. A day without embarrassment was a good day. An evening without awkwardness was a relief. Life was not about achieving visible happiness, but about avoiding visible failure. Satisfaction came from stability rather than joy, from knowing you had not disrupted the careful balance of social order. This focus on avoidance shaped ambition itself. People learned to want what was acceptable rather than what was personally meaningful. Careers were chosen for respectability as much as interest. Marriages were evaluated for suitability, not passion. Even hobbies were filtered through usefulness or refinement. Anything that appeared excessive, impractical, or self-indulgent raised questions. Desire was expected to be reasonable, controlled, and quietly justified. Over time, this constant adjustment narrowed the emotional range of daily life. Strong feelings were not eliminated, but they were postponed. Many people likely assumed that fulfillment would come later, after marriage, after financial stability, after social approval was secured. But later often arrived quietly, looking much like before. The structure remained, the rules stayed in place, the waiting continued. This made time feel strangely flat. Years passed marked by routine rather than memory. Major life events stood out precisely because everything else blended together. Weddings, funerals, and formal celebrations punctuated long stretches of similar days. Change happened, but slowly, and often without ceremony. The absence of drama was considered a success. Even personal failures were expected to remain discreet. Financial trouble, marital dissatisfaction, or emotional struggle were managed privately, if at all. Asking for help risked exposure. Admitting difficulty suggested incompetence or moral weakness. As a result, many people endured quietly, believing their struggles were personal rather than structural. The social world reinforced this silence. Sympathy existed, but it was limited. Comfort was offered cautiously, often framed as advice or moral encouragement rather than emotional support. The goal was improvement, not understanding. Feeling better mattered less than behaving correctly. Order always took priority over comfort. Despite this, Victorian society functioned remarkably well on the surface. Streets were orderly, institutions were stable, public life appeared calm. This external success reinforced the belief that the rules were necessary, even beneficial. If things looked respectable, they must be working. Any discomfort experienced by individuals was treated as a private matter, not a reason for change. For many, this created a sense of quiet resignation. Life was something to be managed rather than explored. The idea of personal fulfillment existed, but it was vague and secondary. What mattered most was fitting in, contributing appropriately, and maintaining appearances. Identity became closely tied to role performance rather than inner experience. Yet, beneath this restraint, people remained human. They felt boredom, frustration, longing, and fatigue. These feelings did not disappear simply because they were inconvenient. They were absorbed into routine, expressed indirectly, or redirected into acceptable outlets. Writing, reading, religious devotion, and private reflection offered limited relief. These activities allowed emotion to exist without disrupting order. Looking back, it becomes clear that Victorian social rules were less about cruelty and more about fear. Fear of disorder, fear of unpredictability, fear of social collapse. Control felt safer than freedom. Restraint felt responsible. The system persisted because it promised stability in exchange for personal ease, and many were willing to make that trade. As night settled in and homes grew quiet, people prepared themselves to repeat the same careful behaviors the next day. Another series of polite interactions, another set of unspoken calculations, another effort to remain appropriate, respectable, and unnoticed. The rules did not demand enthusiasm, they demanded consistency. And consistency, over time, shaped everything. It shaped how people saw themselves, how they understood success, how they imagined the limits of their own lives. The absence of obvious suffering made the cost easy to overlook. Nothing was visibly wrong. Nothing demanded immediate correction. Life simply continued, orderly and restrained. To live with. Victorian social rules was to accept a version of life that valued control over comfort and appearance over ease. It required attention rather than courage, endurance rather than rebellion. Many succeeded at it, many adapted, and many likely never considered that life could be lived differently. It was not a world of constant misery or oppression. It was something quieter than that, a world where normal life required effort, where calm was maintained through discipline, and where rest, even when it came, was always shaped by expectation. And so the era moved forward, carried by millions of small, careful choices made each day by people doing their best to remain respectable. No grand resistance, no dramatic collapse, just a steady, polite endurance that defined everyday existence. A life that looked calm, felt controlled, and required far more effort than it ever admitted. By now, it should be clear that Victorian social rules did not rely on constant enforcement because they no longer needed to. They were self-sustaining. People corrected themselves long before anyone else had the chance. The possibility of judgment was enough. Most discipline happened quietly, internally, and without witnesses. This created a strange relationship with freedom. Freedom was not openly opposed, but it was treated cautiously, like something fragile that could easily become irresponsible. Acting freely required confidence that most people were never encouraged to develop. Safer to follow the script, safer to remain within boundaries that had already been approved by society. Freedom, when discussed at all, was usually abstract, philosophical, and carefully detached from daily behavior. Over time, this careful living shaped memory itself. What people remembered were not moments of joy, but moments of success in restraint. The dinner that went smoothly, the visit that caused no offense, the conversation that ended without discomfort. These small victories accumulated quietly, forming a sense of competence built not on expression, but on avoidance. The absence of mistakes became the highest standard. Excellence was invisible. A well-lived day left no trace. Attention was something to be avoided, not sought. To be noticed was to be vulnerable. To remain unremarkable was a form of protection. This mindset extended even to moral behavior. Goodness was often defined as compliance rather than compassion. Following rules mattered more than understanding people. Charity existed, but it was structured, conditional, and carefully observed. Helping others was acceptable, provided it reinforced social order rather than questioned it. Sympathy was regulated, empathy was restrained. In such a system, individuality survived only in small, private ways. Personal preferences were modest, opinions were softened, differences were expressed indirectly, if at all. Many people learned to keep the most personal parts of themselves separate from public life, protected behind routine and politeness. This separation made life manageable, but also distant. Silence, again, played a central role. Not the dramatic silence of conflict, but the everyday silence of things left unsaid. Silence preserved harmony. Silence prevented embarrassment. Silence allowed everyone to pretend that everything was functioning exactly as it should. It was easier to remain quiet than to risk disrupting the balance. As years passed, this balance began to feel permanent. The rules seemed timeless, even though they were not. They were treated as natural laws rather than social agreements. Questioning them felt unnatural, almost rude. Many people likely assumed that life had always been this way, and that it always would be. Yet the cost accumulated slowly. Fatigue became normal. Emotional distance felt familiar. People adjusted their expectations downward without fully realizing it. Wanting less became a form of adaptation. Hope narrowed. Ambitions softened. Dreams, when they existed, were practical and carefully framed. Still, life continued. People found meaning where they could, in routine, in duty, in quiet competence. Pride came from endurance rather than enjoyment. Respect came from consistency rather than creativity. The system rewarded those who could maintain control, not those who sought change. From the outside, Victorian society often appears orderly, dignified, even elegant, but living within it required constant effort. Every interaction demanded attention. Every choice carried social weight. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for life to feel heavy. The weight came from repetition, from never fully letting go. And yet, many people lived entire lives within this structure without openly rebelling against it. Not because they were content, but because the alternative felt unclear. The rules, however restrictive, provided direction. Without them, there was uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing Victorian society truly disliked. So people continued. They adjusted their posture, their tone, their expectations. They learned to live carefully, politely, and quietly. They passed the rules on, often without comment, simply by example. Children watched, learned, repeated. To live with Victorian social rules was not to suffer constantly, but to endure consistently. The challenge was not surviving hardship, but maintaining composure. Not expressing pain, but managing it invisibly. Not seeking freedom, but avoiding discomfort. It was a life that rewarded patience, punished excess, and valued stability above all else. A life where success meant fitting in so well that you were barely noticed at all. And perhaps that is why, even now, the era feels strangely familiar. The pressure to behave correctly, the fear of standing out, the effort required to appear calm. The Victorians did not invent these feelings. They simply perfected the system around them, quietly, politely, and with remarkable endurance. At some point, this endurance stopped feeling like endurance at all. It became routine, and routine has a way of disguising effort. When something demands constant attention but never changes, the mind learns to conserve energy by accepting it as normal. Victorian social rules were exhausting, but they were also predictable, and predictability can feel oddly reassuring, even when it is restrictive. This predictability shaped expectations about life itself. Many Victorians did not expect life to be enjoyable. Enjoyment was optional, occasional, and best kept modest. What mattered was propriety, stability, and the slow accumulation of respectability. If life felt dull, that was not necessarily a failure. It was often interpreted as proof that things were functioning as intended. This outlook affected how people responded to dissatisfaction. Rather than asking how life could be changed, the more common question was how one might better adapt. Discomfort was internalized as something to be managed privately. Complaints were softened or redirected. Endurance was praised. Adjustment was admired. The system rewarded those who could bend without visibly breaking. As a result, many people became highly skilled at living within limits. They learned to reduce expectations, to find satisfaction in routine, and to measure success by consistency rather than growth. A steady life, even if emotionally narrow, was preferable to an unpredictable one. Risk was not romanticized. It was something to be minimized. Social approval remained the central currency. Being accepted mattered more than being understood. Reputation mattered more than honesty. These values shaped decisions large and small, from career paths to personal relationships. Choices were filtered through a simple question: how will this look? The answer often mattered more than how it felt. Over time, this emphasis on appearance created a subtle distance between people and their own emotions. Feelings were experienced but not fully examined. Reflection existed, but it rarely led to outward change. Many people learned to observe their inner lives without acting on them, treating emotion as something to be acknowledged briefly and then set aside. This did not mean Victorian life was empty. It was full, but in a controlled way. Days were structured, roles were clear, responsibilities were known. For some, this clarity was comforting. It reduced uncertainty and limited difficult choices. Knowing what was expected allowed people to move through life without constant negotiation. But clarity came at the cost of flexibility. When circumstances changed, adaptation was slow. New ideas were approached cautiously. Social rules lagged behind reality even as society itself transformed through industrialization, urbanization, and scientific advancement. The external world moved forward. Social behavior struggled to keep up. This tension created a quiet strain. The rules remained rigid while life grew more complex. Expectations did not always match lived experience. Yet the solution was rarely to question the rules themselves. Instead, individuals adjusted quietly, stretching endurance a little further, narrowing expectations a little more. For those who benefited from the system, the rules felt justified. They provided order, reinforced hierarchy, and protected established positions. For those who struggled, the rules felt immovable. But even dissatisfaction was often framed as personal inadequacy rather than systemic limitation. If you could not thrive, the assumption was that you had failed to adapt properly. This belief kept the system intact. Responsibility was individualized. Pressure was internalized. The social structure remained largely unquestioned because its costs were absorbed privately rather than confronted publicly. There was no single moment of collapse, only a gradual accumulation of fatigue spread across millions of lives. Still, people lived. They found moments of comfort where they could. Familiar routines, trusted companions, small pleasures that fit neatly within acceptable boundaries. These moments mattered, even if they were limited. They made endurance possible. As the Victorian era progressed, cracks slowly appeared. Some rules softened, new voices emerged. But for much of the period, daily life remained shaped by careful behavior, restrained emotion, and constant self-monitoring. Change came gradually, unevenly, and often reluctantly. Looking back, it is tempting to reduce Victorian social rules to caricature. Stiff manners, tight clothing, polite silence. But living within that system was less about spectacle and more about repetition. The true weight of the rules was felt not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. In how people sat, how they spoke, how they avoided saying what they felt. To live with Victorian social rules was to learn how to manage yourself continuously. Not just your actions, but your reactions. Not just your words, but your thoughts. It was a life that rewarded calm surfaces and penalized visible struggle. And so people adapted, not because the rules were kind, but because they were everywhere. They shaped what was considered normal. They defined what felt safe. Over time, they became difficult to see at all, precisely because they were doing their job so well. Life went on, quiet and orderly, carried forward by habit rather than enthusiasm. Another day structured by expectation, another set of small decisions made carefully, another evening spent preparing to do it all again tomorrow. Not dramatic, not openly oppressive, just a long lesson in how much effort it can take to appear perfectly composed. Eventually, this careful way of living shaped not only behavior, but imagination. People learned to picture their futures within narrow, socially approved outlines. Ambition was trimmed down to something sensible. Dreams were adjusted until they looked practical, respectable, and unlikely to disturb anyone. The question was rarely what you wanted, but what would be appropriate to want. This quiet narrowing of possibility made life feel settled early. Many Victorians entered adulthood already resigned to a particular path. Change was possible, but it was slow, cautious, and often uncomfortable. Reinvention was not celebrated. It was treated as a sign that something had gone wrong. Stability mattered more than self-discovery, even if that stability required personal sacrifice. The body itself became part of this discipline. Posture mattered. Movement mattered. Sitting too casually suggested poor upbringing. Standing incorrectly hinted at laziness or defiance. Physical expression was limited, refined, and constantly corrected. Even comfort was suspicious. If something felt too easy, it probably looked improper. Discomfort, endured quietly, became another signal of virtue. This discipline extended into aging. Getting older did not bring freedom from expectations. If anything, it brought more. Older individuals were expected to embody the rules perfectly, having supposedly mastered them over time. Eccentricity might be tolerated in small doses, but only if it appeared harmless and controlled. Serious deviation was not admired. It was quietly pitied or avoided. Death, like everything else, followed a script. Mourning was regulated. Grief had acceptable shapes and timelines. Sorrow that lingered too long became uncomfortable for others. Recovery was expected. Life was meant to return to order even after loss. Emotion was allowed, but only briefly, and preferably without inconvenience. All of this produced a society highly skilled at appearing composed. Calm faces, measured voices, controlled environments. The surface rarely cracked, not because people were untroubled, but because showing trouble was discouraged. The result was a culture where internal experience and external behavior drifted further apart over time. In private, people likely felt more than they admitted. They worried, they longed, they grew tired. But these feelings were rarely shared openly. Instead, they were folded into routine, carried quietly, and managed alone. Privacy was not a place of expression so much as a place of containment. This separation made connection difficult. Relationships were polite, stable, and often emotionally distant. Intimacy existed, but it was restrained. Vulnerability was risky. Trust developed slowly, if at all. Many people learned to rely more on structure than on other humans, finding reassurance in routine rather than in emotional closeness. Yet the system persisted because it functioned. Society did not collapse. Institutions endured. Public life remained orderly. These outcomes were treated as proof that the rules were necessary. If people felt tired or constrained, that was unfortunate, but not considered a reason for change. The absence of chaos mattered more than the presence of ease. This made Victorian life quietly demanding rather than dramatically harsh. There were no constant crises, no obvious villains enforcing the rules. The pressure came from everywhere and nowhere at once. From expectations passed down, reinforced, and rarely questioned. From the shared agreement that things should remain as they were. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine moments of rebellion, dramatic breaks from convention. And those moments did exist, but they were rare, risky, and often punished socially rather than legally. Most people did not rebel. They adapted, they adjusted, they endured. endurance was safer than resistance. As years passed, this endurance shaped collective memory. The era remembered itself as dignified, orderly, and restrained. The effort required to maintain that dignity was largely forgotten. History preserved the manners, not the fatigue behind them. The appearance of calm survived better than the cost of sustaining it. To live under Victorian social rules was to participate in a long, careful performance. Not an exciting one, not a dramatic one, but a consistent one, repeated daily, quietly, and with remarkable discipline. Success meant fitting in so thoroughly that your presence barely registered. Comfort was never the goal. Expression was limited. Ease was secondary. What mattered was maintaining the surface, preserving the structure, and ensuring that life continued without visible disruption. The rules did not promise happiness, they promised order. And for a society deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, that was enough. So life moved forward, one careful day at a time, another measured conversation, another restrained reaction, another quiet adjustment to expectation. The effort required rarely became visible because visibility itself was discouraged. It was not a life designed to break people quickly. It wore them down slowly, politely, and with very little drama. A steady demand for composure, repeated until it felt ordinary. And that, perhaps, is the most accurate way to understand Victorian social rules. Not as a list of restrictions, but as a way of living that asked people, every single day, to be a little smaller, a little quieter, and a little more careful than they might otherwise have been. Not unbearable, just persistently, politely, and deeply tiring. By the end of a lifetime lived this way, many Victorians probably could not have explained the rules explicitly, even if asked. They were no longer ideas, they were instincts. The body responded before the mind, a hesitation before speaking, a correction of posture, a softening of tone. These adjustments happened automatically, without effort or reflection, because they had been practiced for decades. This made the rules remarkably durable. They did not depend on belief or agreement. You did not need to think they were good or fair. You only needed to follow them, and following them became easier than questioning them. Habit replaced conviction. Routine replaced reflection. Life moved forward through repetition rather than intention. There was something quietly unsettling about this kind of endurance. Not because it involved constant suffering, but because it left so little room to notice what was missing. When expectations are narrow, imagination adjusts accordingly. People learned not to expect ease, openness, or emotional relief. Those things were not absent in a dramatic way. They were simply never offered as possibilities. Instead, fulfillment was framed as duty well performed, a respectable household, a steady position, a reputation free of scandal. These were the markers of a successful life. If they were achieved, one was meant to feel satisfied, whether or not satisfaction actually followed. Doubt, when it appeared, was usually treated as a private weakness rather than a reasonable response to constraint. This explains why Victorian society could feel both stable and fragile at the same time. Stable on the surface because everyone knew how to behave. Fragile underneath because that stability depended on constant effort. Remove the effort, and the calm would not sustain itself. Order was maintained not by ease but by vigilance. And yet, most people did not experience their lives as oppressive. Oppression suggests force. Victorian social rules relied less on force and more on agreement, even if that agreement was inherited rather than chosen. People complied because compliance was normal, expected, and rewarded. Non-compliance carried social costs that were rarely dramatic, but consistently discouraging. This created a culture where survival meant fitting in, and fitting in meant becoming skilled at self-restraint. Over time, restraint became a form of identity. You were respectable because you behaved respectably. There was little separation between who you were and how well you followed the rules. The two blurred together until they felt indistinguishable. For those who benefited from this system, it felt justified. The rules protected status, reinforced order, and made life predictable. For those who struggled, the rules felt immovable. But even dissatisfaction was shaped by the system itself. People learned to express frustration cautiously, if at all. Many never articulated it, assuming that discomfort was simply part of being an adult. The absence of open rebellion does not mean the absence of strain. It means the strain was absorbed quietly, distributed evenly, and normalized over time. Everyone carried a small portion of it every day. No single burden was overwhelming, but together they added up to a life that required constant management. This is perhaps why Victorian life appears so calm in retrospect. The photographs, the writing, the preserved etiquette manuals all emphasize control. What they rarely show is the effort behind that control. The pauses before speaking, the energy spent monitoring tone, the fatigue of always being appropriate. Living under Victorian social rules meant living with an ongoing awareness of how you appeared to others. Even when alone, that awareness lingered. The audience was internal by then, watching, evaluating, correcting. You did not need observers. You had learned to observe yourself. As the era slowly gave way to new ideas, some of these rules softened, others simply changed form. The language shifted, the expectations adjusted. But the underlying habit of self-monitoring did not disappear overnight. It had been practiced too long, too thoroughly. It lingered, quietly, shaping behavior even when the original rules no longer applied. This makes Victorian social life less distant than it first appears. The specifics may feel unfamiliar, but the structure is recognizable. The pressure to behave correctly, the fear of standing out, the effort required to appear calm and capable. These are not relics. They are patterns, repeated in different forms. To live with Victorian social rules was not to endure constant crisis or obvious cruelty. It was to participate in a system that valued order above comfort and appearance above ease. It asked people to be careful, consistent, and composed day after day without ever fully relaxing into themselves. The result was a society that functioned smoothly and exhausted its participants quietly. A world where life was not unbearable, but rarely restful. Where success meant not being noticed, where failure meant gentle exclusion rather than open punishment. And so, generation after generation, people learned to live within these expectations, adjusting themselves just enough to belong. They did not need to love the rules. They only needed to follow them. Over time, following them became automatic. That is what it was like to live with Victorian social rules. Not dramatic, not openly harsh, just a steady, polite demand for self-control, repeated so often that it stopped feeling like a demand at all. A quiet history, one that asks very little noise and a great deal of patience. By the time these habits had settled in so completely, many Victorians likely mistook restraint for maturity. Being an adult meant knowing how to hold yourself together, how to keep things contained, how to move through life without creating inconvenience. Ease was not a sign of success. Control was. And the highest form of control was appearing unaffected. This shaped how people understood strength. Strength was not loud or visible. It was quiet, inward, and often invisible. A strong person did not complain. They endured. They adapted. They carried discomfort privately and continued as expected. Weakness, by contrast, was associated with excess emotion, unpredictability, or the inability to maintain composure. The goal was not to feel less, but to show less. Over decades, this outlook created a culture deeply skilled at managing appearances and deeply uncomfortable with honesty. Honesty was risky because it introduced uncertainty. If you said what you truly felt, you might invite questions, concern, or judgment. Politeness, on the other hand, smoothed everything over. It kept interactions predictable. It allowed everyone to move on without disruption. This predictability became a kind of social safety net. You knew how people would behave. You knew what was expected of you. Even if the expectations were tiring, they were familiar. Familiarity reduced fear. In a rapidly changing world, that mattered. Industrial growth, crowded cities, and shifting economies created instability elsewhere. Social rules offered something solid to hold on to. The cost, of course, was emotional openness. Many people learned to treat their inner lives as private burdens rather than shared experiences. Feelings were processed alone, or not at all. Support networks existed, but they were structured around duty and propriety rather than vulnerability. Comfort was indirect. Care was practical. Emotional reassurance was limited. This did not mean people lacked affection. They cared deeply, often intensely. But affection was expressed through consistency rather than confession, through presence rather than language, through doing what was expected, day after day, without complaint. Love, friendship, and loyalty were demonstrated quietly, not declared loudly. As a result, relationships were stable but often restrained. Many connections lasted a lifetime, not because they were deeply examined, but because they were rarely challenged. Change was avoided. Conflict was softened. The relationship itself became part of the routine, something reliable and familiar, even if it lacked warmth or excitement. Looking back, it is easy to underestimate how much effort this required. The constant adjustment, the continuous monitoring, the careful calculation of behavior. None of it was dramatic enough to be remembered individually, but together, it formed the background labor of daily life, a labor that rarely received recognition because recognition itself would have drawn attention. Victorian social rules were effective precisely because they did not feel like rules. They felt like common sense, like manners, like simply knowing how to behave. People did not wake up thinking about conformity. They woke up thinking about breakfast, work, and the day ahead. Conformity happened in the background, quietly guiding choices without needing instruction. This is why the system lasted as long as it did. It was not imposed from above so much as reinforced from all sides. Family, school, church, workplace, and community all pointed in the same direction. Deviating from that direction felt lonely and risky. Staying within it felt safe, even if it was tiring. When change eventually came, it did not arrive all at once. It arrived unevenly, through small shifts in attitude, language, and expectation. Some rules loosened, others transformed, but the habit of restraint lingered. Generations raised within it did not shed it easily. Self-monitoring had become second nature. This lingering influence is part of why the Victorian era still feels close, not because we follow the same rules, but because the impulse behind them remains familiar. The desire to appear competent, the pressure to behave correctly, the effort to manage impressions. These are not uniquely Victorian. They were simply refined, formalized, and elevated into a way of life. To live with Victorian social rules was not to endure constant suffering, nor was it to live in comfort. It was something in between, a steady, manageable strain. A life that required attention and discipline more than courage or strength. A life where success meant blending in and failure meant standing out. There were no daily battles to fight, no obvious enemies to resist. The challenge was quieter than that. It was learning how to exist within narrow boundaries without letting the effort show. How to remain composed even when tired. How to keep going without expecting relief. And so, people did exactly that. They lived carefully. They behaved properly. They endured politely. Day after day, year after year, until the pattern felt normal and the effort faded into the background. That is what it was like to live with Victorian social rules. Not dramatic, not openly cruel, just a long exercise in self-control, repeated so often that it became invisible. A quiet history. One that never raised its voice and never quite let anyone rest. By the time the Victorian era finally began to loosen its grip, many of the rules had already done their work. They had shaped instincts, expectations, and habits so thoroughly that even when the rules faded, the behaviors often remained. People did not suddenly relax. They simply found new ways to be careful. The structure changed, but the reflex to manage oneself endured. This lingering restraint explains why the period feels so internally consistent. Life moved at a measured pace. Days followed recognizable patterns. Surprise was minimized. Predictability was valued. For many Victorians, this was not experienced as oppression, but as adulthood. Responsibility meant knowing your limits and staying within them. Freedom was something discussed in theory, not practiced casually. What stands out looking back is how much energy was invested in appearing normal. Not exceptional, not expressive, just correct. Correct posture, correct tone, correct reactions. Being correct was safer than being interesting. Interesting invited attention. Attention invited judgment. Judgment was exhausting. Even moments of change were filtered through restraint. New technologies, new ideas, new social movements all arrived, but they were absorbed cautiously. The surface of daily life remained calm, while deeper shifts happened slowly underneath. People adjusted without announcing it, maintaining the appearance of continuity even as the world changed around them. This ability to adapt quietly was one of the era's defining skills. Victorians were excellent at living with contradiction. They valued tradition while experiencing rapid change. They emphasized control while living in increasingly complex environments. The rules helped them cope, even as they limited them. Order provided comfort, even when it demanded constant effort. It is easy to imagine Victorian society as rigid and unyielding, but in practice, it was flexible in subtle ways. People bent rules privately. They found small allowances. They learned where the boundaries were soft enough to lean against without breaking. These quiet negotiations made life possible. They allowed individuals to survive within a system that rarely acknowledged individual needs. Still, the cost of this careful living was cumulative. Fatigue did not announce itself dramatically. It settled in gradually. A tiredness of being observed, a tiredness of restraint, a tiredness of always knowing how to behave. By the end of a long day or a long life, that effort could feel heavy, even if it had never been named. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Victorian social rules. They were not experienced as a series of punishments. They were experienced as normal life. And normal life required work, not physical labor alone, but emotional and social labor, performed quietly and continuously. To live in that world was to accept that comfort was optional and composure was essential, that feelings were private and appearances were public, that success meant fitting in smoothly and failure meant standing out awkwardly. These assumptions guided behavior without ever needing to be spoken aloud. And so, as the era passed and the rules slowly dissolved into history, what remained was not outrage or rebellion, but habit. The habit of restraint, the habit of self-monitoring, the habit of presenting a calm surface regardless of internal state. These habits outlasted the period itself. That is why Victorian life feels both distant and familiar. The clothing is strange, the etiquette is elaborate, but the underlying experience of managing impressions, of being careful, of measuring oneself against expectations, still resonates. The Victorians did not invent these pressures. They simply organized them into a system and lived within it thoroughly. In the end, living with Victorian social rules was not about surviving extreme hardship. It was about enduring ordinary life under constant expectation. It required patience more than bravery, consistency more than passion. It rewarded those who could remain composed and penalized those who could not. There was no final moment of release, no dramatic end. Life simply continued, carefully, until the rules changed enough that people no longer recognized them as rules at all. What remained was the quiet understanding that being acceptable mattered, that being calm mattered, and that standing out was rarely worth the cost. A quiet way of living, a careful way of existing, and a reminder that history is not always loud or violent or dramatic. Sometimes it is slow, polite, and deeply tiring in ways that are easy to miss, which makes it, in its own way, the perfect kind of history to quietly drift off to sleep to. And so, if you had lived an ordinary life under Victorian social rules, you would likely not have described it as harsh or unbearable. That would have sounded dramatic, and drama was rarely encouraged. You might have called it proper, orderly, normal, words that suggest stability rather than comfort, and expectation rather than choice. Normal life meant knowing, at all times, how you were supposed to behave. It meant sensing when to speak and when to remain silent. It meant adjusting yourself slightly, constantly, without ever quite noticing how often you did it. The effort was steady and familiar, like carrying a weight that had always been there. What makes this kind of life difficult to fully grasp is how little of it involved crisis. There were no daily emergencies, no constant punishments. The pressure worked precisely because it was mild, continuous, and widely shared. Everyone participated. Everyone reinforced it. And because it was everywhere, It rarely felt optional. In that environment, even rest was shaped by expectation. A quiet evening was acceptable. Reflection was fine, as long as it remained contained. Solitude was permitted, but only if it did not appear antisocial. There was always a correct way to relax, just as there was a correct way to work, speak, and feel. Nothing was entirely free from evaluation. This meant that true mental rest, rest without awareness, was rare. Even alone, people carried the habits of restraint with them. They sat properly. They thought cautiously. They measured reactions that no one else would see. The audience had long since moved inside. Over years, this produced a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of physical labor or emotional crisis, but the exhaustion of constant self-management. The kind that does not announce itself clearly. The kind that becomes part of the background, quietly accepted as what life feels like. Many Victorians likely believed this was simply adulthood, that growing up meant learning to suppress impulse, accept routine, and endure discomfort politely. Youth was something to outgrow. Enthusiasm was something to moderate. Seriousness was a sign of maturity. If life felt restrained, that was proof you were doing it correctly. From that perspective, the system made sense. It rewarded predictability. It minimized conflict. It kept public life calm. It created a society that functioned smoothly on the surface. And for many, that smoothness was worth the trade. Stability mattered more than spontaneity. Order mattered more than ease. But the cost was paid quietly, by individuals, day after day, in the effort it took to remain appropriate, in the energy spent avoiding attention, in the careful shaping of words, gestures, and expressions. None of this was dramatic enough to be remembered as suffering. It was simply how life worked. This is why Victorian social rules are easy to underestimate. They did not rely on force or fear in obvious ways. They relied on habit, expectation, and the quiet desire to belong. They asked people to manage themselves rather than be managed by others, and people, for the most part, complied. To live in that world was to learn how to disappear slightly, to become less noticeable, to take up the right amount of space and no more. Success meant fitting so neatly into the pattern that nothing about you disrupted it. Failure meant small discomforts, quiet exclusions, and subtle judgments rather than open punishment. Over a lifetime, those small pressures added up. They shaped personalities, relationships, and inner lives. They influenced what people hoped for and what they gave up hoping for. They defined what felt possible and what felt unrealistic, all without ever needing to say so out loud. And yet, people lived. They married. They worked. They laughed quietly. They found meaning where they could. Humans adapt well, even to systems that limit them, especially when those systems present themselves as normal, respectable, and unavoidable. So, if you had asked a Victorian whether life was difficult, many might have hesitated. Difficult compared to what? This was simply life. It had rules. It required care. It demanded restraint. That was adulthood. That was society. That was how things were done. Looking back now, with distance and different expectations, it becomes clearer how much effort was required just to maintain that calm surface. How much energy went into appearing composed. How much of life was spent managing impressions rather than experiencing moments. Living with Victorian social rules was not about surviving catastrophe. It was about enduring normalcy. A normalcy that asked for constant attention, quiet patience, and reliable self-control. A normalcy that rewarded those who blended in and gently discouraged anyone who did not. It was a life that did not shout, threaten, or dramatize its demands. It whispered them, steadily, until they felt natural. And because they felt natural, they were rarely questioned. A quiet system, a careful society, and a reminder that history does not always weigh on people through obvious suffering. Sometimes it presses down softly, politely, and continuously, until the pressure feels like part of the air itself. Which is why, if you had lived under Victorian social rules, you might not have complained very much. You would have adjusted, you would have endured, and you would have gone to bed each night knowing exactly how to behave again tomorrow. Calmly, correctly, and just a little bit tired. And that quiet tiredness would not have felt unusual. It would have felt earned. A sign that you had moved through the day correctly, without incident, without embarrassment, without drawing the wrong kind of attention. In Victorian life, the absence of trouble was its own achievement. By then, you would no longer notice how often you adjusted yourself, the careful phrasing, the restrained reaction, the way you anticipated expectations before they were spoken. These behaviors would feel less like choices and more like reflexes. You would not think of them as rules, you would think of them as manners, as common sense, as simply knowing how to be. This is what made the system so effective. It did not require belief, only participation. You did not need to agree with the rules, you only needed to follow them, and following them was easier than facing the quiet consequences of not doing so. Over time, ease replaced resistance, habit replaced awareness. Looking back, it is tempting to search for moments of relief, places where Victorians might have truly relaxed. And those moments did exist, briefly. In solitude, in familiar routines, in trusted company where performance could soften slightly. But even these moments were modest. Relief was partial, relaxation was careful. Nothing ever fully escaped the reach of expectation. What stands out most in the end is how little noise this way of life produced. No constant rebellion, no widespread outrage, no dramatic collapse. Just millions of ordinary people doing their best to remain respectable, day after day, year after year. The effort was spread thinly across time, making it easier to bear and harder to see. Victorian social rules did not make life unbearable, they made it narrow. They defined the acceptable path clearly and discouraged wandering from it. For those who stayed within the lines, life was predictable and stable. For those who did not, the penalties were subtle but persistent. Either way, the rules shaped nearly every moment. To live with those rules was to accept that ease was not guaranteed, that expression was limited, and that comfort was secondary to appearance. It was a life organized around restraint rather than release, around order rather than openness. A life where being proper mattered more than being happy, even if happiness occasionally found its way in quietly. And so, when night came and the day finally ended, there was no great sense of triumph or failure, just completion. Another day done correctly, another set of expectations met, another performance finished, ready to be repeated again tomorrow. That was what it was like to live with Victorian social rules. Not shocking, not tragic, not especially memorable. One day to the next. Just a long series of careful days, stitched together by habit, politeness, and endurance. A quiet history, the kind that rarely makes headlines, but slowly, steadily, teaches you how much effort it can take to appear calm. And if you tried to explain that effort to someone living inside it, they might have looked at you with polite confusion. Effort implied struggle, struggle implied complaint, and complaint implied that something was wrong. Victorian life, after all, was designed to appear as though nothing was wrong. Everything was orderly, everything was functioning. Any discomfort was assumed to be personal, temporary, or simply part of growing up. This assumption shaped how people judged themselves. If you felt restless, you learned to correct yourself rather than question the system. If you felt tired, you assumed you lacked discipline. If you felt out of place, you adjusted your behavior rather than your surroundings. Self-improvement meant better conformity, not greater freedom. The goal was always to align more closely with expectations, never to ask whether those expectations were reasonable. Over time, this produced a culture deeply invested in self-correction. People monitored tone, posture, and expression the way others might monitor weather or time. It was automatic. You noticed yourself constantly, but without panic or urgency, just a steady awareness, humming quietly in the background of every interaction. This background awareness made social life feel dense. Nothing was casual. Even informal moments carried structure. Conversations followed predictable rhythms. Pauses meant things. Small gestures carried weight. Life was not spontaneous so much as managed. The management was so thorough that it rarely felt like management at all. What is striking is how little space there was for uncertainty. Uncertainty made people uncomfortable. Clear rules reduced ambiguity. Even when the rules were inconvenient, they were preferable to not knowing how to behave. In that sense, Victorian social rules acted as a kind of emotional infrastructure. They organized interaction, reduced friction, and made public life legible. But infrastructure always shapes behavior. Roads determine where people travel, Walls determine where they can stand. Victorian rules determined which emotions could be shown, which desires could be expressed, and which ambitions felt realistic. They shaped lives not through dramatic restriction, but through constant guidance. This guidance was especially powerful because it was rarely framed as control. It was framed as refinement, as improvement, as becoming better, calmer, more civilized. To resist refinement was to appear crude. To reject restraint was to appear immature. Few people wanted to be seen that way, so most learned to comply willingly. Even joy was shaped by this framework. Pleasure was acceptable, but it had to look appropriate. Excitement was moderated. Satisfaction was understated. Happiness was something you acknowledged quietly, without letting it spill over into excess. Anything too intense risked making others uncomfortable, and causing discomfort was one of the few clear social failures. As a result, emotional life often unfolded inwardly. People felt deeply, but they experienced those feelings alone. Expression lagged behind experience. Reflection replaced reaction. Silence replaced conversation. This inwardness was not always lonely, but it was isolating. Shared emotional language was limited. Many feelings simply had nowhere to go. Still, people adapted. They always do. They found meaning in routine, pride in composure, and identity in being reliable. Reliability mattered. Being someone others could predict was valuable. It made you safe. It made you acceptable. It made you respectable. Looking back, it is tempting to search for villains in this system, to blame institutions, traditions, or rigid moral codes. But the truth is quieter. The system worked because people participated in it, reinforced it, and passed it on. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit, out of fear of disorder, out of a shared belief that calm was worth preserving, even at personal cost. This makes Victorian social rules difficult to condemn outright. They were not designed to harm. They were designed to stabilize. They succeeded. Public life was orderly. Institutions endured. Communities functioned. But the price of that stability was paid privately, in small increments, over long stretches of time. A little less expression, a little more caution, a little more self-editing every day. By themselves, these adjustments were manageable. Together, they formed a way of life. And so, if you had lived through it, you might not have felt oppressed. You might not have felt miserable. You would simply have felt careful, attentive, slightly restrained. You would have known how to behave, and you would have behaved that way, because that was what adults did. There would have been comfort in that knowledge, comfort in predictability, comfort in knowing the boundaries, even if they were narrow. Life would have felt controlled, and control often feels like safety. But safety has a texture. It can be firm, or it can be tight. Victorian social rules wrapped daily life in a careful order that rarely loosened its grip. They asked people to manage themselves quietly, continuously, and without complaint. They promised stability in return. Many accepted the trade. And that is perhaps the simplest way to understand it. Living with Victorian social rules was not about dramatic suffering or heroic endurance. It was about quiet compliance, about doing what was expected, about maintaining the surface. A life made of many small acts of restraint, performed so consistently that they disappeared into normalcy. A calm society, a composed culture, and a reminder that sometimes the most exhausting histories are the ones where nothing seems to happen at all. And when nothing seems to happen for a very long time, that itself becomes the story. Victorian life was built on the assumption that stability was the highest good, and stability requires repetition. The same gestures, the same phrases, the same careful movements through familiar spaces. Days differed in detail, but rarely in shape. Variety existed, but within limits that felt reassuring rather than exciting. This repetition trained people to lower their expectations of novelty. Surprise was not something to seek out. It was something to manage. A sudden change in behavior, mood, or circumstance required explanation, and explanation drew attention. Attention, again, was uncomfortable. It was easier to keep things predictable, even if predictability became dull. In this way, boredom was quietly normalized. Not acknowledged openly, of course. Boredom suggested dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction suggested ingratitude. But the steady sameness of daily life meant that many people learned to coexist with a low-level sense of monotony. They did not fight it. They folded it into routine, treating it as another feature of adulthood. This had subtle effects on imagination. When life rarely changed, it became harder to imagine it changing at all. The future looked like a continuation of the present, perhaps slightly improved, but fundamentally similar. Ambitions became incremental rather than transformative. Progress meant refinement, not reinvention. The idea of radically altering one's life felt unrealistic, even irresponsible. Social rules reinforced this outlook by rewarding consistency over experimentation. People who stayed the course were trusted. People who changed too much were watched. Reliability mattered more than originality. Being dependable was safer than being inspired. Over time, inspiration learned to keep a low profile. Even creativity, where it existed, was disciplined. Art, literature, and music followed conventions that emphasized form, structure, and restraint. Innovation was acceptable when it appeared controlled and respectful of tradition. Excess was criticized. Boldness required justification. The safest path was gradual evolution, not sudden departure. Within families, these patterns repeated themselves. Children observed adults navigating life carefully and learned to do the same. Expectations were passed down not through lectures, but through example. You learned what mattered by watching what was praised and what was quietly corrected. By adulthood, the lessons were complete. This generational transmission made Victorian social rules remarkably resilient. They did not depend on enforcement from above. They lived in everyday interactions, in raised eyebrows, in gentle reminders, in moments of silence that communicated more than words ever could. The rules survived because they were practiced constantly, even lovingly, by ordinary people. And yet, beneath this calm continuity, fatigue accumulated. Not enough to cause revolt, just enough to dull enthusiasm. Life required attention, but offered limited release. Rest existed, but it was structured. Leisure existed, but it was purposeful. Nothing was allowed to become too loose, too expressive, or too uncontrolled. This balance produced a society that functioned smoothly, but left little room for emotional expansion. People adapted by narrowing their expectations and finding satisfaction in small, approved pleasures. A well-run household, a successful visit, a day without embarrassment. These modest achievements mattered. Looking back now, the Victorian era can feel strangely quiet, not because nothing happened, but because so much was deliberately contained. Conflict was softened, emotion was moderated, difference was smoothed over. Life moved forward without many sharp edges, but also without much room to breathe. To live with Victorian social rules was to live in a world where calm was carefully maintained, not naturally present, where composure required work, where self-control was constant, and where the effort behind that composure was rarely acknowledged, even to oneself. The result was a way of life that did not exhaust people all at once, but wore them down gradually. A life that asked for attention every day and offered relief only in small, measured doses. A life that felt stable, respectable, and quietly demanding. No dramatic suffering, no obvious cruelty. Just an endless series of ordinary days, each one requiring you to be careful, polite, and composed. And if you managed that successfully, you were considered to have lived well. That was the promise. That was the expectation. And for many Victorians, that was simply life as they knew it. And yet, within all that sameness, life still moved forward in small, almost imperceptible steps. Children grew taller, faces aged, houses filled and emptied. The rules stayed largely the same, even as the people following them changed. This continuity created the illusion that time itself was calm, even though years were passing quietly underneath the surface. Victorians did not mark their lives by moments of release or transformation. They marked them by milestones that fit neatly into the social structure. Education completed, employment secured, marriage arranged, children raised, retirement endured. Each stage came with its own expectations, and moving through them correctly mattered more than enjoying them deeply. Progress was measured by conformity, not by fulfillment. This way of living made emotions feel strangely inefficient. Strong feelings disrupted routine. They demanded attention. They slowed things down. As a result, emotions were treated like interruptions rather than information. If sadness lingered, it was something to manage. If joy grew too visible, it was something to temper. Balance was prized, even when it flattened experience. One of the quiet consequences of this was a constant sense of being slightly behind oneself. Thoughts and feelings were always one step removed from action. By the time something was expressed, it had been filtered, softened, and reshaped into something acceptable. Spontaneity rarely survived the process. What emerged instead was a carefully edited version of inner life. This editing became so habitual that many people likely forgot what they were editing in the first place. Feelings that were never expressed eventually lost clarity. Desires that were never pursued became vague. Over time, people learned to want less, not out of wisdom, but out of adaptation. It was easier to adjust desire than to challenge structure. The social world rewarded this adjustment generously. People who fit well were praised quietly, trusted, included, given responsibility. Those who struggled to adapt were not usually punished outright. They were simply edged away from opportunity. Fewer invitations, shorter conversations, less patience. The message was subtle but consistent: adjust or drift. Because the consequences were rarely dramatic, they were easy to accept. Nothing terrible happened all at once. Life simply became smaller, more constrained, more predictable. And predictability, again, felt safe. Even when it was dull, it reduced risk. In a world without clear alternatives, safety mattered. This explains why Victorian society could be both emotionally restrained and deeply moralistic. Rules were not just about behavior, they were about identity. Being respectable meant being good. Being good meant being controlled. Control became a moral value in itself. Losing control, even briefly, was not just embarrassing, it was suspect. This suspicion extended to anyone who lived differently. Artists, reformers, outsiders, and nonconformists were tolerated unevenly. Some were admired from a distance, others were dismissed as unstable. The line between genius and impropriety was thin, and most people had no desire to test it. Safer to remain unremarkable. The irony, of course, is that this culture of restraint required immense emotional intelligence. People had to read rooms carefully, interpret silences, anticipate reactions, adjust themselves constantly. Victorian social life was not simple. It was intricate. It demanded attention, memory, and subtlety. It was exhausting precisely because it was complex. And yet, because everyone was doing it, it felt normal. The effort was shared. The burden was distributed. No one person carried all of it, but everyone carried some. This made it harder to notice. Like background noise, it faded from conscious awareness while still shaping experience. As the day ended, evenings often brought a slight loosening, but never a release. Conversation softened, movement slowed, but propriety remained. Even fatigue had to be expressed politely. There was a correct way to be tired, just as there was a correct way to be cheerful or serious. Sleep itself offered only partial escape. Dreams were private, but waking life resumed immediately, with all its expectations intact. Morning brought not freedom, but familiarity. The same routines, the same rules, the same careful adjustments. There was comfort in knowing what to do, even if doing it required effort. This rhythm continued, day after day, year after year, until it defined what life felt like. Not exciting, not tragic, just steady, measured, controlled. A life that asked you to participate quietly and rewarded you for not standing out. From the outside, it can seem cold or restrictive. From the inside, it likely felt reasonable, necessary even. This was how society worked. This was how order was maintained. This was how adults behaved. Questioning it would have felt unnecessary, perhaps even childish. And so, people rarely questioned it. They adapted, they endured, they passed the habits on. The rules lived on through example rather than enforcement, through routine rather than reflection. That is what made Victorian social rules so powerful. They did not need to be defended loudly. They were already everywhere. In speech, in posture, in silence, in the spaces between words. To live under them was not to feel constantly oppressed, but to feel constantly guided. Guided toward calm, toward restraint, toward a version of life that valued order above ease. A quiet life, a careful life, and a reminder that sometimes the heaviest histories are the ones that move slowly, politely, and without ever raising their voice.